Hey everybody, this is Jack Allwell with another money episode. Today we have Dan from Resilient REI with us. Dan, welcome to the show.
Jack, thank you so much for having me, man. This is exciting. I'm pumped for this.
Yeah, it's nice to put a face to the Twitter account. It is Dan's at Resilient REI on Twitter. And well, before we get into your real estate endeavors, why don't we start with your relationship with money growing up?
Absolutely. Well, my family moved probably in 2006 or so to I would say a upper middle class neighborhood. Great schools, definitely had some very wealthy neighbors, but also, there was a good cross section of not so wealthy people. And it was a situation where my father was working in the building material industry, and anybody who knows, the whole 2008 crisis, everything building material, residential, commercial, that all got hit real hard. So I wasn't really aware of the full breadth of how difficult it got financially. My parents did a very good job of kind of hiding that. And so growing up, I always kind of knew that we were better, than a lot of Americans for sure, but there were a lot of people like in the community that really kind of set the expectation off a little bit. Um, so I grew up like a middle class upbringing, and my whole approach to money and my parents' approach to money was save money, and that's basically all the education I got. And I felt pretty lacking in that, as I feel a lot of millennials feel. And so I always just kind of was waiting for who's going to teach me about money. I felt like, middle school, we got all these expensive calculators for like some math class we had to take, the TI 98 or TI, whatever it is, like $150 calculator that we all had to get. And I was like, okay, they're giving us this expensive calculator. We have to go out and buy these expensive calculators. They're now going to teach us about money and how to make it and how to get wealthy, because obviously we need these really expensive calculators. And we just use them for graphs, like black and white graphs. And like we never, we did it for a couple lessons and then we were done with it, but we had to have them. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe in high school, they'll teach me about money. Took a whole bunch of classes, nothing about money. There was one about consumer education, which was literally consumer education, right? How do you write a check? How do you pay your taxes? And that was about it. So then I was like, okay, fine. It must be really complicated if I have to go to college to learn how to make money. And so I figured, well, I'm going to get the degree that teaches everything about money, which is finance. And was pretty disappointed that nothing really just kind of laid out like, hey, here is how you achieve wealth. Here's how you build wealth. Here's how you retain wealth. It was all, theoretical stocks, bonds, macroeconomics, microeconomics. And so I ended up graduating college with a finance degree and was kind of thinking like, hey, if I'm going to learn how about money, I have to do it on my own approach, because I was never taught. So that's kind of, and it all kind of came about of just my parents saying, hey, we just need to save money, save money, save money, kind of from the depths of the financial crisis. And it kind of spurred me on to this journey of like, hey, I need to figure this out for myself. And I feel like I've come a long way.
Mhm. Now, during the financial crisis, was it apparent right then and there that they were maybe struggling a little bit, or was it really hidden? And did they involve you at all?
So there were some leading up to the financial crisis, the building material industry was doing really well, right? A lot of building going on in the United States. So the company that my dad was working for and actually still works for was doing really well. Everybody was making money. And so I remember there was talk about us going back to our ancestral roots in Scotland and taking the family trip, because my mom is very Scottish. And so we were all sat down like, hey, we're going to go to Scotland this year. And then there was maybe a little bit of talk about us getting like a car or something, like upgrading cars. And then all the stuff on the news happened that I didn't really understand. And then that vacation never really materialized. So there were like a little bit of, there were hints, but it was never brought up like, hey, this is what's going on.
Okay. Your story sounds, I had a recent guest on, it was residential OG whose father was also in, I think, some sort of building or concrete area, and very similar story to yours. It's kind of interesting to hear this. So, okay. So after you get out with your finance degree, what's your next step?
Well, if I could back up just a little
Sure.
bit, when I was in college, I started like watching all this stuff, and I've been such a huge fan of podcasts that I thought I'm going to do my own podcast. That's how I make money, right? Like
Okay.
you, and kind of maybe we'll get to it a little bit later, but real full circle on that. So I decided to build a podcast where I'd go around the Chicago startup ecosystem. That's where I went to school. That's where I'm from, Chicago, interviewing people who are in the startup world, entrepreneurs, people who are funding these startups. It was not very sophisticated at all on what credentials I would give people to call them, bona fide entrepreneurs.
Uh-huh.
But I was running around interviewing all these really interesting people. And it came to a point where I made a little bit of money off of the advertising side, but I realized like, hey, the way that this plays out is I get the best job possible after I graduate. And this is one hell of a way to network. So I just use it as a network of like, okay, this is a really impressive person. Hey, do you know anybody who's hiring? Like,
Uh-huh.
and then all of a sudden people started realizing like, hey, this guy is in college, which kind of blew people's minds because they thought I was a lot older. And so kind of one thing led to another, and I ended up getting a series of interviews with a company called Outcome Health, which was the premier startup in Chicago. It was, they were the golden child of the Chicago ecosystem. And the Chicago startup ecosystem has always had a little bit of a chip on its shoulder. And I think that that's the case of a lot of the Midwest. We bristle at being called flyover country between, flying from New York to LA. And so we had Groupon. Groupon was a huge hit, raised the most amount of money in Chicago startup history at a little over $1 billion. And then Groupon kind of did what Groupon did and kind of fell apart. And this was right at that time when people realized, like, hey, Groupon's not really going to amount to anything. They've had their time in the sun, but Outcome Health was crushing it. And what they did is they put touch screens into doctors' offices, and kind of think of it like a 32-inch TV, but flipped portrait style.
Mm-hmm.
And it was touchscreen. So it was like a giant iPad. And doctors could go through all these different animations of like let's say you had lung cancer, and the doctor was explaining, this is what a lymph node is. This is what stage 1 of lung cancer looks like compared to stage 2 of lung cancer compared to stage 3. Like, and then able to really just explain it in no uncertain terms. Whereas before they were using, just those old dusty posters in doctors' offices.
Mm-hmm.
So the technology was really, really cool. And they had raised, I think, $550 million right before I joined in.
Okay.
So right out of college, I got a job there. I was an entry level sales guy, setting appointments for my senior account executive. I learned a lot about sales, and I was there for about 6 months. Hit up all these records, and then we were all very quietly brought into a conference room,
Okay.
and we were told, "Hey, there's going to be a little bit of fake news about Outcome Health in the Wall Street Journal." And what's kind of interesting about this was right after Theranos was broken open by the Wall Street Journal, like weeks later. And so we all kind of knew, like, okay, is this something along those lines? But the executives that did such a good job of like just, sprinkling the Kool-Aid around everybody, that there were so many people in that office who were like, don't worry, like, no, everything is fine. Everything is above board. We raised all this money, yada, yada, yada. And then there are also people who are like, hey, there's something really wrong here. Books are being kept, books are being prepared and then given to the accounting team. And hey, why did the entire accounting team leave the company? And then we rechanged the company name. Like, all this shady stuff happened like right before I joined, but I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea to look for that.
Mm-hmm.
And what ended up happening was just the company fell apart. It was proven, and recently it all shook out recently in the judicial system, that there was a lot of fraud, defrauding investors, clients, pretty much everybody, to the tune of $550 million. And it got worse because that next election cycle, one of their lead investors, J.B. Pritzker, ended up becoming governor of Illinois. So
Okay.
you don't want to piss off billionaires. Just a good rule of thumb.
So that 6 months, that was that out of school, or was that like Was that during school
That
or
was
just
that was
right out?
right out of school, living at home. You know, I had no overhead. I was just I mean, I was just kind of thrown in a catapult.
Uh-huh. Okay. So what's your next move after that?
I discovered real estate. That's kind of the next move. Um, what ended up kind of happening is there was a real coming to Jesus moment when it finally really sunk in, like, hey, this company, you know, we had 3 baristas on staff, we had free lunches, free food, the whole kit and caboodle, ping pong and all that. uh, Corporate or job security is a myth at the corporate level. And I also saw how there's a lot of risk when it comes to the startup world for my podcast days. So I was like, how I still need to build wealth. How am I going to do it? Corporate might not be the way, startup, the whole that route might not be the way. And I landed on real estate because there's 4 proven ways to build wealth, build money. You buy a house, you're able to use debt, and somebody else is paying that debt down for you. That house is more than likely going to appreciate every single month. You're going to be getting cash flow from the rent minus all the costs. Plus, there's a whole lot of tax benefits from owning that piece of property. So once I kind of really understood that, I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And it took 3 years before I bought my first property. And that first year that we ended up buying property, 3 years later, we ended up buying 3 properties, to the point now where we've got 5 doors, you know, little over $1 million in assets under management. And, you know, we're about to move into our first house hack. So it really all kind of spurred from seeing Outcome Health just absolutely fall apart. So I guess in a weird way, I am thankful for that experience, especially when it happened to me, because it was really scary when that all fell apart. Just seeing people sales guys who are making $300,000-$400,000 a year, living large, living paycheck to paycheck, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I have to find another $300,000 or $400,000 job, and I've got a stain of working at a fraudulent company on my resume. So, you know, there's sometimes things God just puts stuff in your path for you.
Mm-hmm. I also got into real estate after losing a job, so I'm with you there. Now, typically to learn those 4 levels or levers of real estate, you know, you have to study, you got to do the research. So were there any key resources that, you know, when the light bulb really clicked and you're like, yes, real estate's the vehicle I want to use to build wealth?
Well, I think it's the quintessential going and discovering Bigger Pockets, the Bigger
Okay.
Pockets podcast, and that whole media ecosystem was really instrumental when I first started out. Reading the books, listening to the podcast, watching Brandon Turner break down, I think it was the 4 square method on how to evaluate a rental property. And then I later on, I discovered Michael Zuber's One Rental at a Time, which was like the next big step forward for me. I learned a lot from him. And then kind of the evolution is then going into Twitter and what I've done with Twitter and being able to learn from some really incredibly successful investors and
Cool.
finding just a community to kind of hone my skills and build from.
Awesome. So those 3 properties you have, can you share a little bit about, and you said it's 5 doors. So is it like 2 singles and a 3, or how's that shake out?
Sure. So it's the first property was a single family in Milwaukee. I'm based in Chicago. Milwaukee's just a short drive over. Found a great property manager. And the whole objective for that property was not to have a home run per se, but just not to strike out. I just did not want a nightmare. Was recently married. And so I just didn't want to have a nightmare for this first property because my wife was a little bit reticent about real estate.
Okay.
Like, why are we putting 30, 40, whatever $1,000 into this property? You know, we could use that to buy a new car. Right. And it's like, no, we're going to use it. We're going to get $200 a month in cash flow, yada, yada, yada. So it's like, that can't just be a nightmare. And thankfully, knock on wood, it's been very good to us. I think cash flow, it's been averaging about $500 a month, which has been, you know, above what our expectations for that property was.
And when
And
did you
then
buy
we
that
went,
property?
We
When was
bought
that?
it in March of 2021.
Okay.
We got married in September of 2020. So a couple months after that. And then we then kind of went on a little bit of a tear. We were not expecting to keep on buying properties that year. We thought we were just going to buy one property that year and then another property the next year. But we just kind of stumbled upon this really interesting subset of the Milwaukee real estate market with these townhouse condos where they live like a single family, 3, 4 bedrooms, 2 bath. It's got a basement, first floor, second floor, dedicated parking, no garage, but there is dedicated parking, and then a little bit of like a kind of a gated backyard area. And they were mispriced because investors don't want to buy in an HOA.
Yeah.
And if you're a homeowner, you're not buying a townhouse condo. You just spend a little bit more, to buy a house. So these properties were undervalued, and we picked up 3 of those, and they've been really good to us. I think that they're doing about $500 or $600 a month in cash flow.
Okay.
And then the last purchase that we've made was at the January of this year, was a duplex out in a very nice suburb outside of Chicago.
Okay. How did you come across Milwaukee to begin with?
Well, a little bit of an interesting story there. So I was right when I was like doing those 3 years of really study, reading books, listening to Bigger Pockets. I was talking to everybody about how I wanted to get into real estate. And I feel like a lot of people kind of get into that where they're talking about real estate, but they haven't bought anything yet. And so people are just kind of like, yeah, okay, whatever. But I was having a conversation with a friend of mine from college, and he's like, "Oh, you should buy in Milwaukee." I said, "Why Milwaukee?" He said, "Because there are cheap houses there." And it was that little back and forth. Nothing ever, we never like came back to it. We never like did a full divulge, had a full deep conversation on it. And I, in all honesty, haven't spoken to him a lot since that conversation. But for some reason, there are cheap houses in Milwaukee just kind of sat in the back of my mind. And when I was doing all this research and all this study, I just kind of had, Milwaukee, right? I can buy cheap houses there. And I started doing more of the math. The price to rent ratio is really strong there. There's a strong tenant base. There's a lot of multifamily. And then I started realizing like, hey, I got connections who are actually landlords and own rentals in that market. So it kind of all came into, it was just kind of like a happy coincidence, in all honesty. It wasn't, I just like, okay, yeah, Milwaukee, and boom, it's been very good to us. And I think that that's something that a lot of people might be able to take note from, is you could spend months and months just identifying a market and evaluating a market. But at the end of the day, you're not going to do anything until you actually like get on the ground and like start making things happen. And so that's what, there are great deals in every single market. It just comes down to which market you like the best.
Another thing you touched on that I think is a common, I don't want to call it problem, but maybe a challenge, is getting the spouse on board. Because I see this a lot with like one spouse is really gung ho on real estate and the other one's really hesitant. How did those conversations early on go to get your now wife on board?
It wasn't easy. My wife is from Brazil. She grew up in Brazil, and she moved to the States about five years ago now. And so you do that. I feel like when she first came here and we first started dating and we first got married, she was still kind of doing a little bit of the currency conversion in her head, where $1 equals 5 reales, which is the currency denomination in Brazil. So for every 1 unit of currency here, you could buy 5, units of currency there. So it's like, wow, if we're going to be spending $20,000, we're spending 100,000 reales. That's a lot of money. The average income, I think it's like 1,100 reales a month in Brazil is like what the average income is. So it's like, wow, we are spending 10 years worth of income on this one property.
Wow.
But it kind of came down to just showing the math, just talking it through, being like, yeah, but if we get this property and it gives us $200 a month, that's a gym membership, that's a phone bill, and then also, maybe getting, coffee a couple times a month. Okay, well, then we do that. What if we do it again? 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 Like how would that look like in our life? And I think that what we kind of discovered is by being married, right, and living on one of our incomes and then investing the other income, we were able to save up that money fairly quickly, and we just didn't live large. And so we had this money, we had a little bit of money set aside, and we went up. We met the property manager, myself and my wife. We had a very long, very productive conversation. It came down to, she's like, okay, I trust you, and as in the property manager, I trust this property manager, and I think you know what you're doing. So it's like, I think I've got enough of this might be a good idea. So that's also why this first deal had to go right, and it couldn't have, couldn't be a nightmare. And so it's like that leap of faith that we took on that first property that's turned out wildly successful, and in retrospect, is what really sold my wife. And now she's like, how many properties are we going to buy next year? We need to go out and buy more real estate.
Okay, so a couple of questions come to mind now. So on the property management side, are you guys paying 10% of the gross rents? Is that kind of how it's structured?
Yep, 10% of the gross rent, a month for leasing commission, pretty standard, standard operating procedure. And we are very lucky. There's a lot of bad property managers out there, and we're very fortunate to have a good one.
And how did you find them to begin with? A lot of people kind of ask, how do you vet them, or how do you, yeah.
Well, I played to my network, and I also had a number of meetings with property managers up in Milwaukee. So before I met my current property manager, I had a number of meetings with property managers up there, and it's like there's a wide range of professionalism when it comes to that segment of the market. And so you see very clearly, who answers their phone, who answers their email, who is just generally professional, who seems like they know, seems like they're a decent business person. And eventually I just got to the point where I was just asking my network, and we had a family friend who owns a bunch of properties up there, and he was working with this property manager. I was like, yeah, I'll get you guys connected. She's been very good to me, and my portfolio. I've been working with her for decades. And so then having that meeting, it's like, okay, this person is obviously a lot more qualified than the other meetings I've had. And we also had that meeting at her office, which I think is really important, because you get to see how organized their office is. Do they have a board, the board of keys with all the keys and all the addresses next to all of them. She showed us into her basement, and she said, you want to see something? And the entire basement of this bungalow that she had converted into her office was filled with LVP flooring. It's all the same kind, because all the same flooring goes on all the same rentals. Buckets and buckets of paint, all the same color paint, all these humidifiers. And then she had a stack of like $8,000 worth of smoke detectors. Okay. So it's like this, she knows what she's doing. She's clearly an expert. And it's like, okay, I think it was the smoke detectors. That's what probably got my wife to like, yeah, she probably knows what she's doing.
Cool. So just to summarize, so you got so it's 3 townhomes in Milwaukee, and then your duplex? Is that?
Yep. And a single family.
And a single family. Okay, cool. Now are the townhomes are all in the same HOA, I guess, community?
2 of them are. One is in a separate HOA, but they all, they all kind of trade at for the same price.
How have the HOAs been? Have you encountered any issues thus far?
I really haven't. Okay. It's been pretty sleepy. I mean, you hear a lot of HOA horror stories, and so far so good. I think that there might be a fair number of investors who are also in those developments. But it also comes down to having a property manager who knows that market like the backside of her hand, because she's like, yeah, I've managed properties in these developments. I know investors who are in these developments. So it wasn't like we were going in completely cold.
Okay. And the duplex, can you give us some of the numbers behind this deal?
This is a very interesting deal. And this is one that has been a labor of love, and we're nearing the finish line of it. So we were not anticipating on buying a duplex. We were not anticipating on house hacking. It's a house hack, if I haven't mentioned that before. But I think it was December of last year. my wife was looking on Redfin, and she's looking in this awesome, beautiful neighborhood that we both love, but it's way out of our price range. We can never afford to live there. I mean, we could if we really wanted to, but again, we only live on one income, and that's just how we live. That's our priority, to live on one income, invest the rest. And she's like, "Hey, there's a duplex here." And I'm like, "There's no duplexes in that neighborhood." And she's like, "Well, there's one on Redfin." So I open it up, and I'm like, okay, they're asking $730,000. That's a lot, and it's a duplex. And I started running the numbers, and Rentometer says I could get like $6,000 a month in rent. Like, this might work. And then there's a pool in the backyard, and the back unit has got 4 bedrooms, 2 bath, but the front unit looks like a complete and total disaster. Um, and I was like, but you know what? The numbers check out. This might be and I was like, I'm gonna call it the realtor. And she's like, "What do you? No, no, no." She's like, "Don't do that. Don't do that. And I'm like, "I'm gonna call it the realtor." So I call it the realtor. Guy's name is Jeremy. I was like, "Hey, man, I'm interested in this duplex. I'm not working with any agent. I'm totally cool with you representing me. Like, let's talk about this property." And he was like, "Yeah, man." And so we started talking. We eventually got the property under contract in January, and then it became a very long close. We did not go to closing until May. So from January to May, which is what, 5 months ish. And that's for a number of reasons. The owners who are living there, it was owner occupied. They were building a new house, and the house wasn't going to be ready until May. And so we're like, why don't you just stay there, and we'll just keep saving money, rather than sell it and then rent it back to you and have to figure out like the whole headache. Because that way in May, both the tenant who was going to live there would leave the property, and then the owner would move out. So it's like, okay, that makes sense. But it was just kind of stressful because you're looking at the interest rates, and they were just going all over the place. So I think that when we first got our contract signed, rates were like 7.2, which I guess right now when we're recording it doesn't sound all that bad. But it was, but we were just looking at like, man, we're not going to be able to lock in a rate until 30 days beforehand. And we were like, this could go, rates could go to 7.5, it could go to 8%. We had no idea. But we got lucky. We timed it pretty well. We got a rate of 6.625, closed in May, did a little bit of work in the former owner's unit, which is the back unit. And then we went to see if we couldn't get it rented. And we were just like, there's no comps for it. There's no comps for a duplex in this market with a above ground pool, with a private little fenced in backyard. It's a unique, weird property. And so we were getting quotes of anywhere between $3,000 a month to $5,000 a month. And the mortgage, just so you know, the mortgage is $5,200. So mortgage, taxes, insurance, all that. $5,200 is our fixed cost. And so we're like, well, why don't we list that $4,000 a month? And knowing that we might not get it rented until October, and we're fine with that. We could afford to float it until October. And we might end up renting it for $3,000, and we might have to pay $2,200 to live in this front unit that we're going to have to do a ton of work to. And so we were really nervous. But as soon as it hit the market, we got flooded with interest. It was pretty wild. The state's top real estate agent, who I think her name is like Katie Byer or something. Her last name is Byer, which is really funny. She came through the property, and the person that we were working with to help rent that was like, "Do you know who she is? Do you know who she is?" And she was like going around, she was like FaceTiming or whatever her client. It's like she does not do that for anybody. She's like, she never does rents, and sort of like thought that's a good sign. So we got lawyers who are looking at the property, corporate relocation situations. We're looking at the property, and my wife and I are like, I think that we priced this property a little bit too low. $4,000 a month. Like who would have thought? But we ended up having a really great selection. We picked a great tenant, who's been absolutely wonderful, a young family. And then from May until today, we've been rehabbing the front unit. We're probably gonna be putting in $40,000 into it. Almost a gut rehab. because it had not been touched since like the early 90s. It's missed a lot of love over the years.
Okay. So what was the final rent? That
$4,000.
4 grand. Okay, cool.
Yep.
So that rentometer at 6K was really for both units, and it was low even. Cool.
Well, it
Or
was for that rear unit, but it's just
uh-huh.
it's just no comps. I
No
think there was
comps,
like
right?
there was like a new build townhouse or something that was, like spectacular, that was a couple miles away. But it's like you really can't just take one unit on a rentometer as like,
Mhm.
as like
Right. Gospel. Yeah.
a good, yeah, gospel.
Yeah.
That's what the word I was looking for.
Yeah. So when they were building their house, the former owners, that is, from January to May, were you guys just had like a month-to-month lease somewhere? Were you were renting or
Yeah, so we and this is the other thing too, like we're still in our apartment. Our lease
uh-huh.
for our apartment ends in October.
I see.
So
Okay.
I mean, during the
Hmm.
entire time that we've been building this portfolio, we've been renting. So we've been
Cool.
renting, buying rental properties.
Okay, so 40K rehab in the unit you'll be living in. That's pretty cool. What do you have planned for that? Like, what types of projects are, I mean, really everything?
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah, so we're kind of GCing it ourselves. We've got a great family friend who's a contractor who's just been a godsend, who's been helping us out. But I mean, ripping down walls, ripping out the entire kitchen. We got new cabinets. We're gonna do granite countertops, granite backsplash, painting every inch of that house. So really with the exception of one room, which is like the laundry room, which we're not going to do really much of anything to, is going to be substantially changed.
Okay. I think big rehabs seem quite, scary to a lot of people. How did you guys kind of tackle that? Did you find certain contractors? How did people that you tapped?
I think that it's really so. I think that what I learned from the startup space is that a healthy amount of the delusion and ignorance is sometimes not that
Uh-huh.
bad of a thing. Because we were just like, yeah, we'll rip out the cab, we'll put new cabinets in, we'll rip this wall down. We had no idea what we were getting ourselves into. This has been a great learning experience for myself and my wife,
Sure.
and been just a great experience for our marriage to kind of go through this, because it's not, a lot of this has not been easy. Um, when we go up to Milwaukee, and one of the benefits of having a property manager is when you need to create a bedroom or paint this or change out cabinets there, they're handling it, right?
Right.
They've got their list of preferred contractors to work with. So we decided to do it to GC it ourselves, to manage it ourselves. I've got an uncle who has a remodeling company that we've been able to tap some of his employees when they've got spare time, and then also just us learning, right? Learning how to paint has been
Mhm.
what I've been very proud of recently, is learning how to paint a ceiling.
Cool. Step by step for sure. So I'd like to pivot a little bit, and maybe you could tell us a little bit about your new podcast coming up, Landlord Horror Stories.
Absolutely. Well, you know, Jack, I don't know what your exposure like to the whole real estate online world has been, but there's just been so many people talking about like how easy and how passive
Yeah.
the whole real estate game is, and anybody who has done it knows that just things happen. And I was just finding myself like, I just love hearing when things go wrong. I don't know if
Mhm.
it's cathartic or what, but I just really like hearing just when things go wrong and how people are able to solve these problems. And I couldn't find anything on the real estate side for it. So I decided to build a new show where I bring on landlords, and they basically share like, hey, this is when a pipe broke in a house for the entire long weekend when nobody was there, caused $70,000 for the damage, how I was able to remedy the situation. So it's been a fun project to take on, while also doing a remodel. Just
Mhm.
a lot's kind of been on my plate. But to really also just kind of try and do my best to mimic like the sound design that you would see from like a show from NPR, right? Like I want to build something professional and just something interesting, something that people who are in the real estate world, or just people who are just generally interested in personal finance can enjoy and not feel like they have to take, have their pen and paper and take notes through.
Mhm. I will tell the listeners that I heard Dan's first episode, and the production value is very impressive. And I thought I was listening to a different type of show when I turned it on. That's how good it was. So kudos to you
I appreciate
on
that.
Yeah. So as we wind down, actually, there was one other question I had. People, the fact that your wife is Brazilian, have you guys considered investing at all back in Brazil?
So we've kicked around the idea. It's funny enough that my wife, her family actually in Brazil. This is a little bit of a tangent, but they are also kind of house hacking.
Okay.
They live on the second floor, and on the first floor there's a pet shop so that they rent out, which is kind of a little interesting wrinkle in all this. I don't know if we'd rent, we'd invest in Brazil. I think that eventually we definitely will buy like a second house down there, just a place where we can hang out with our family and kind of get together. But maybe not 100% sure on that.
Okay. Yeah, more and more people are bringing up jurisdictional risk these days. So yeah, always interesting to hear people's plans. So okay, as we close out, I like to ask every guest, Dan, what is the best and worst personal finance advice you have heard or received?
I would say the best advice that I have heard comes from Mike Zuber, and he talks about the buy box, and that every single day, 20 minutes a day, you need to look at your market and just take note of what's for sale, what has sold, and if there's been any new rental, apartments or any open units that have come up. And you do that, and over time, eventually you'll master that market. There will be nobody who will understand it better than you. And you just need to do it 10, 15, 20 minutes a day. And for me, for my Milwaukee, it's a couple of zip codes I pay attention to. I don't look at the entire city. That would be way too taxing. And so, for right now in my market, there's only 2 properties that are up for sale, and neither of them make sense. And that just kind of is what it is. So that's the best piece of advice that I've had. The worst piece of advice that I've had is to enjoy your 20s. So I'm nearing the end of my 20s. I'll be 29 in October. And I remember after college, there's just a lot of people who should not have been giving me financial advice, but gave me financial advice just to enjoy your 20s, travel, do this, do that. And in your 30s, you'll be able to get more serious, and 40s, and, kind of kick the can down the road. And looking back on it, that's such awful advice, because your 20s is such a time when you've got a dwindling window where you can take risk, where you can start a podcast, where you can buy real estate, and for it to just completely implode, and you can rebuild and completely implode and rebuild. It's harder to do that when you've got, real bills, and you've got family, dependents, and the time value of money is just way different in your 30s, 40s, and 50s than it is when you're in your early 20s. So I think that would be the worst advice that I've ever been given.
Interesting. Yeah, the 20 minutes every day that you mentioned, the best advice. I saw you tweet on that like yesterday. Open Redfin, just 20 minutes a day, enter properties that went up for sale or sold, just into a Google sheet. Is that how you track it? Google sheet?
Yep.
Yep.
Google Sheet doesn't need to be anything fancy, and
Yeah.
20 minutes a day doesn't need to be 6 hours on a Sunday.
That's all you need to master your market, everybody. So, okay. Well, Dan from ResilientREI, why don't you tell people where they can go to learn more about you, listen to the podcast, and get in touch with you if they want?
Absolutely. And Jack, thank you again so much for inviting me on your show. I'm on Twitter. I live on Twitter. ResilientREI. REI stands for real estate investing, for all those, not in the know. And I'm launching a new podcast called Landlord Horror Stories that we mentioned. We'll be on everywhere that you can get your podcasts, starting in late August.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I think the listeners got a lot of value out of today's show, and I thank you for coming on.
Absolutely. Jack, thank you again, man. Really appreciate it.
Take care.